The morning air was thick with the Texas summer heat as Caroline Sanders moved through her quiet home in Austin. The soft hum of the coffee machine filled the kitchen while her two children laughed faintly in the backyard, their carefree voices floating through the open window. For a moment, everything seemed perfect, stable, just as Caroline had always wanted. But perfection, she would soon learn, was as fragile as glass. Caroline's life had always been predictable, almost idyllic. Married to David Sanders, a diligent financial consultant, she had built a life she could be proud of. Their house in a suburban neighborhood was modest yet charming, nestled among tree-lined streets and manicured lawns. It was the kind of place where secrets felt impossible, where everyone knew everyone. Yet, as Caroline would soon discover, secrets had their way of festering even in the brightest corners. She was tidying up the bedroom that morning when she noticed David's leather suitcase resting on the chair. It wasn't unusual, he often traveled for work, but something about its placement caught her attention. The case was unzipped, its contents spilling slightly over the edge. With no particular intention, her hand moved to adjust the clothes inside when she felt the hard edge of a small velvet box. Her breath hitched. Pulling it out, she opened the box to reveal an elegant gold necklace adorned with a single teardrop diamond. It was breathtaking, luxurious, far beyond what David would ever splurge on her, even for special occasions. Attached to it was a handwritten note, the ink still fresh. To Evelyn, my star. For all the light you bring into my life. Love, David. The words hit her like a physical blow. Evelyn. Her twin sister. Caroline's knees weakened, and she sank onto the edge of the bed, clutching the box as her vision blurred. Her mind raced through memories, Evelyn's frequent visits, her laughter that lingered too long when David made a joke, the late-night texts Caroline had dismissed as work-related. Each moment, once brushed off as innocent, now felt like a glaring red flag she had willfully ignored. David and Evelyn. It seemed unfathomable, like a story ripped from a tawdry novel. But the note was there, undeniable proof of the betrayal lurking beneath the surface of her carefully curated life. For a long time, Caroline sat frozen, her thoughts spiraling into chaos. Confronting them immediately was her first instinct, a storm of accusations and shattered glass. But a second thought crept in, deliberate and calculating. Confrontation would only drive them underground, force them to weave their lies tighter. No, she needed to play the long game. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, snapping her out of her daze. It was a text from Evelyn. Hey, coming over later? I have something exciting to tell you. The words dripped with irony now, their casualness cutting deeper than the truth already had. Caroline took a deep breath and placed the necklace back in the suitcase. Her hands were steady now, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let them see her crumble. The funeral of their childhood friend Sophia, just 2 months away, would provide the perfect stage. A stage where secrets would no longer be hidden but exposed, raw and undeniable. For the first time that morning, Caroline smiled. Not a smile of joy, but one of quiet, calculated determination. If David and Evelyn thought their betrayal could remain in the shadows, they were gravely mistaken. Caroline Sanders had always been the anchor of her family, the dependable one. Even as a child, she had been the glue that held things together, a trait that carried her into adulthood. Growing up alongside her identical twin sister, Evelyn, their differences had always been stark despite their shared features. While Caroline thrived on stability, Evelyn chased excitement like a moth to a flame. Born minutes apart, the Sanders twins were inseparable during their early years. Their parents, though well-meaning, often compared them. Evelyn was the lively one, full of charisma and charm, while Caroline was calm, nurturing, and reserved. Over time, the comparisons built a quiet resentment in Evelyn, one that simmered beneath her bright smile. By high school, their paths had begun to diverge. Caroline stayed in Austin, taking up a job and eventually opening a bakery that became a beloved local spot. Evelyn, ever restless, bounced from city to city, chasing dreams that burned hot but fizzled out quickly. Despite their differences, Caroline never hesitated to be there for her sister. When Evelyn faced setbacks, whether it was a failed business venture or a breakup, Caroline was the first to offer support. But Evelyn had a way of twisting generosity into obligation, and as the years passed, her visits to Caroline's house began to feel less like family bonding and more like a silent takeover. Caroline's marriage to David was a reflection of her personality, steady, predictable, and safe. David was everything she had ever wanted, grounded, hardworking, and dependable. They met through mutual friends when Caroline was 25, and within a year, they were married. Their relationship wasn't passionate, but it was solid, built on mutual respect and shared goals. They bought a modest home in the suburbs of Austin and raised 2 children together, creating the life Caroline had always envisioned. David fit seamlessly into the Sanders family dynamic. He enjoyed Evelyn's energy and humor, but Caroline dismissed any discomfort she felt as harmless sibling rivalry. Evelyn's visits grew more frequent as her own life remained untethered. She was always a whirlwind of charm, dazzling everyone at family gatherings with her stories of glamorous cities and fleeting romances. Caroline, ever the pragmatist, envied her sister's freedom but reminded herself that stability was the life she had chosen, and wanted. Unbeknownst to Caroline, Evelyn's charm had begun to weave its way into David's life. He admired her adventurous spirit, the way she made him laugh in a way Caroline no longer did. To him, Evelyn represented an escape, a stark contrast to the routine predictability of his marriage. It began innocently enough, casual conversations, shared jokes, stolen glances. But as the months passed, those glances lingered, and boundaries blurred. The cracks in Caroline and David's marriage were subtle at first. David seemed distracted when Evelyn was around, his laughter a little too enthusiastic at her jokes. He volunteered to help her with odd jobs, fixing a leaky faucet, setting up her Wi-Fi, and Caroline brushed it off as simple kindness. But deep down, unease began to creep in. Caroline trusted them both, yet there was an undeniable shift in the air whenever Evelyn entered the room. Evelyn, for her part, thrived on the attention. She knew the power she held over David and reveled in it. To her, it wasn't just about him, it was about eclipsing Caroline. After years of feeling like the lesser twin, she had finally found a way to tip the scales. For years, Caroline had ignored the subtle signs, choosing to believe in the strength of her family. But now, holding the evidence of their betrayal in her hands, everything fell into place. Evelyn wasn't just a sister, she was a rival. And David wasn't just a husband, he had become a conspirator in a betrayal that cut deeper than she could have imagined. As Caroline reflected on their intertwined lives, the weight of their shared history pressed down on her. The bonds of family and marriage had been poisoned, and yet, she found clarity in the betrayal. This wasn't just about infidelity, it was a collision of old wounds, unresolved jealousy, and misplaced trust. And it was time to bring it all to light. Caroline Sanders had always been practical, a woman who sought reason over impulse. But the discovery of David's betrayal with Evelyn turned her life into a whirlwind of doubt, anger, and the gnawing need to uncover the truth. Confrontation burned at the edge of her mind, but she knew better than to act without evidence. If there was one thing her years of stability had taught her, it was the value of patience. And so, she decided to observe, to watch, and to collect every sliver of proof she could find. The first cracks had begun to form long before she uncovered the necklace. Caroline thought back to the moments that now seemed glaringly obvious. There was the time David had rushed out late one evening, claiming he needed to help Evelyn fix her internet. He'd returned hours later, his shirt slightly untucked and his explanation rushed. Then there was Evelyn's so-called spa weekend in December. Mutual friends had casually mentioned spotting her at a hotel in Houston, the same hotel where David had attended a conference that very weekend. At the time, Caroline had brushed it off as coincidence. Now, every detail seemed like a piece of a larger, damning puzzle. Her first move was subtle. She began paying closer attention to their interactions. During Evelyn's visits, Caroline noted the way David's posture changed, how his laughter seemed louder and more genuine around her sister. Evelyn, too, was more animated, her gaze lingering on David in ways that were anything but sisterly. Caroline kept her face neutral, her smile intact, even as her insides churned. The second move required more courage. Caroline waited until David left for one of his business trips and quietly searched his belongings. His laptop and phone were locked, but his work bag wasn't. Inside, she found a printed receipt for a jewelry store in Houston, dated 2 days after Evelyn's spa weekend. The item, the gold necklace she'd discovered. Her hands trembled as she snapped a picture of the receipt with her phone, but her resolve only grew stronger. She wasn't imagining things. This wasn't paranoia. It was real. Caroline's investigation wasn't just about gathering evidence, it became a way for her to process the betrayal. She began writing notes in a small leather journal, dates, locations, interactions, every detail that could piece together the scope of their affair. She even created a file on her computer where she stored screenshots of texts she'd discreetly taken from David's unlocked phone one night. Evelyn's messages were flirty, laced with inside jokes and subtle declarations of affection that left no room for interpretation. Yet, for every piece of evidence Caroline uncovered, she found herself battling conflicting emotions. One part of her wanted to scream, to confront them both and watch their faces crumble. But another part hesitated. She thought of her children, of the family life she'd spent years building. Could she risk destroying it all with a single confrontation? The emotional toll was heavier than she anticipated. Sleepless nights became routine as she replayed conversations and interactions in her mind. Her anger toward David was raw, but her resentment toward Evelyn was deeper. This wasn't just a betrayal of marriage, it was a violation of sisterhood, of family. And yet, Caroline couldn't deny the pangs of self-doubt that crept into her thoughts. Had she been too complacent, too predictable? Had she driven David away? The investigation also forced Caroline to grapple with the psychological dynamics of her relationships. Evelyn's actions, she realized, weren't just about David. They were about power, about claiming the attention Evelyn had craved since they were children. David, meanwhile, seemed to be searching for something Caroline couldn't give him, or so he had convinced himself. It was an emotional battlefield, and Caroline was standing at the center, caught between heartbreak and fury. As the weeks passed, her meticulous observations began to pay off. Caroline's suspicions were confirmed when she intercepted an email from Evelyn to David. The subject line read, "Our escape plan," and its content spoke of a weekend getaway, carefully planned to avoid suspicion. She printed the email, added it to her growing pile of evidence, and knew she was nearing a breaking point. But instead of crumbling, Caroline felt her resolve harden. She wasn't just gathering evidence for herself anymore, she was preparing for the ultimate reveal. The funeral in August loomed like a dark storm on the horizon, and she knew it would be the perfect stage to expose them. They had underestimated her, mistaking her silence for ignorance. But Caroline wasn't just waiting. She was planning. Her determination wasn't driven by vengeance alone. It was about reclaiming control, about showing David and Evelyn that their deceit couldn't overshadow her strength. The truth would come out, not in a flurry of anger but with calculated precision. And when it did, there would be no turning back. The day of the funeral arrived with a weight Caroline could feel in her bones. The Texas summer heat bore down on the stone steps of the old church in San Antonio, casting long shadows across the gathering crowd. Guests, dressed in muted tones of black and gray, exchanged quiet condolences as they filed inside. The air was heavy, not just with the grief for their childhood friend Sophia, but with the tension Caroline had carried for weeks. Today, everything would change. Caroline arrived early, her expression composed, her demeanor calm. She clutched a black leather bag containing the evidence she had meticulously gathered, printouts of emails, photographs, receipts, and screenshots. Every piece told the story of betrayal that had poisoned her life. She had spent the past nights preparing envelopes for select guests, family members and close friends, each containing a carefully curated set of damning proofs. Today, she would not just reveal the affair. She would make it unforgettable. David and Evelyn arrived separately, a calculated move to avoid suspicion. Caroline's heart clenched as she saw them, Evelyn, radiant as ever, her makeup flawless, her laughter a little too loud as she greeted old acquaintances. David, by contrast, appeared nervous. His eyes darted around the room, as though sensing the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Caroline noticed how he gravitated toward Evelyn, their interactions subtle yet telling. They thought they had been clever. They thought she didn't know. The service began, solemn and heartfelt. The pastor spoke of Sophia's life, her kindness, and the friendships she had nurtured. Caroline sat in the third row, her bag resting on her lap, her mind racing. She scanned the room, noting the key players, her parents, Evelyn's closest friends, David's colleagues, all people whose opinions would hold weight when the truth came to light. As the eulogy concluded and guests began to rise for the final hymn, Caroline knew her moment had arrived. She stood, moving gracefully down the aisle, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Her presence was steady, deliberate. Guests turned to watch her, curiosity flickering in their eyes. When she reached the podium, she cleared her throat, her voice calm but commanding. "Before we part ways today," she began, "I'd like to share something. Sophia believed in truth, in honesty, even when it was difficult. And in her honor, I feel compelled to reveal a truth that can no longer remain hidden." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the crowd like a thick fog. Caroline's gaze swept over the audience, landing on David and Evelyn, who sat frozen in place. She saw the flicker of panic in their eyes, the tightening of David's jaw, the way Evelyn's fingers gripped her clutch. "I have loved and trusted deeply," Caroline continued, her voice unwavering. "But trust, once broken, cannot be mended in silence. It must be confronted, no matter how painful." She reached into her bag, pulling out the envelopes. Slowly, she began handing them out, starting with her parents, then David's closest colleagues, and finally Evelyn's closest friends. The room buzzed with hushed whispers as people opened the envelopes, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock. Some gasped audibly, others exchanged wide-eyed glances. A ripple of disbelief swept through the congregation. Evelyn rose to her feet, her face pale. "Caroline," she began, her voice trembling, "what are you doing?" Caroline turned to face her sister, her expression unreadable. "I'm doing what you never had the courage to do, Evelyn, telling the truth." David stood as well, his face red with anger. "Caroline, this is not the time or place." "Not the time or place?" Caroline interrupted, her voice sharp. "You made that decision the moment you betrayed me. Both of you." The tension in the room was palpable. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, caught between the spectacle and the solemnity of the occasion. Caroline turned back to the crowd, her voice steady once more. "This is not just about infidelity. It's about family, trust, and the length some will go to destroy it." But then, as Caroline prepared to step away, a voice rang out from the back of the room. Her mother's. "Caroline, stop." The room turned toward the elderly woman, her face ashen, her hands trembling. "You don't know everything," her mother said, her voice breaking. I knew. I knew what they were doing." The words hit Caroline like a physical blow. Her breath caught as the room descended into shocked murmurs. Her mother continued, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I was protecting you. I didn't know how to stop it. I I didn't want to tear the family apart." Caroline's composure cracked, her hands trembling as she clutched the podium. She turned to her mother, her voice barely a whisper. "You knew? And you said nothing?" Her mother's silence was answer enough. The room was no longer just a scene of betrayal but of revelation upon revelation. Evelyn and David stood frozen, their carefully constructed lies crumbling under the weight of Caroline's evidence and their mother's confession. Caroline, for all her preparation, felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She had planned for the betrayal of her husband and sister, but not for the complicity of her own mother. The silence was deafening as Caroline stepped away from the podium, her steps slow, her mind reeling. She had exposed the affair, but the unexpected twist had exposed something deeper. The fractures in her family ran far deeper than she had ever imagined. The days following the funeral were a storm of whispers and confrontation. In the small, tightly knit circles of San Antonio and Austin, the fallout spread like wildfire. What had started as a solemn goodbye to Sophia became a scandal that consumed everyone who attended. For Caroline, the silence of her now empty home was both a relief and a reminder of the destruction she had unleashed. David packed his belongings the very next day, his presence lingering only in the faint scent of cologne on his closet shelves and the dent his favorite chair left on the carpet. He begged Caroline for forgiveness as he loaded his car, his voice desperate and hoarse. "It was a mistake," he pleaded, his words tumbling over each other. "I was weak. I let her manipulate me. Please, Caroline, we can fix this." Caroline stood on the porch, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You didn't just betray me, David. You betrayed our family, our children. This wasn't a mistake, it was a choice." Her voice was calm, almost eerily so, and David knew there was no point in arguing further. With one last look, he drove away, leaving behind the life they had built together. Evelyn fared no better. The once charismatic sister who had lit up every room now found herself shunned. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with the woman at the center of such a scandal. Even their parents, though torn with guilt over their complicity, couldn't bring themselves to defend Evelyn's actions. By the end of the month, Evelyn had packed her bags and moved out of Texas entirely. She left no forwarding address, no tearful goodbyes, just a terse text message to Caroline: "I hope someday you can forgive me." Caroline didn't reply. For the first few weeks, the weight of what had happened threatened to crush her. She moved through her home like a ghost, the silence of her children's absence at school stretching long into the afternoons. The betrayal wasn't just about the affair, it was about the lies, the secrets, and the realization that even the people closest to her were capable of such cruelty. She had exposed the truth, but it left her feeling hollow. The satisfaction she had anticipated never came. But as the days turned into weeks, Caroline found herself rediscovering pieces of her own strength. The bakery, her sanctuary, became her focus. She threw herself into work, creating new recipes and expanding her menu. Word of her resilience spread through Austin, and soon, customers weren't just coming for her pastries, they came for the woman who had faced unimaginable betrayal and stood tall. Caroline's children were her constant source of grounding. She sat them down one evening, explaining in age-appropriate terms why their father had left. "It's not your fault," she reassured them, her voice steady. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes. But I promise, we're going to be okay." Her son, with all the wisdom of a 10-year-old, asked, "Are you okay, Mom?" Caroline smiled through her tears. "I will be." As time passed, Caroline began to find joy in small things she had overlooked for years. Weekend hikes with her children, experimenting with new recipes, and even moments of stillness became precious. She enrolled in a cooking class she'd always wanted to take, connecting with others who shared her passion. Slowly, the void left by David and Evelyn's betrayal began to fill, not with anger or bitterness, but with self-discovery and hope. The twist with her mother's confession weighed heavily on her, though. Caroline confronted her weeks later, sitting across from her at the kitchen table. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you protect them?" Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I was protecting you, Caroline. I thought if I ignored it, it would go away. I was wrong." There was no anger in Caroline's heart, only a profound sadness. "We're supposed to protect each other, Mom. That's what family is for." From that conversation, Caroline found the strength to let go, not just of her anger, but of the need for answers she might never fully receive. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing what happened, it was about freeing herself from the grip of the past. By the end of the year, Caroline's bakery had expanded to a second location, and her life had taken on a new rhythm. She no longer looked over her shoulder, no longer wondered what secrets might be hiding. The scars of betrayal remained, but they were a part of her now, a reminder of her resilience. In her quiet moments, she thought of Evelyn, wondering where she had gone, and of David, who occasionally sent letters apologizing and asking to see the children. She hadn't decided yet how to handle those requests. But for now, Caroline was content to focus on the future she was building, one day at a time. The lesson she carried with her was simple yet profound: the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than living in the shadows. And sometimes, the hardest person to forgive is yourself, but it's also the most important. Caroline wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. The first hints of autumn crept into the air as Caroline Sanders stood on the porch of her bakery, sipping a cup of steaming coffee. The morning sunlight bathed the streets of Austin in a warm glow, and the familiar bustle of customers filled the shop behind her. A year ago, this moment would have felt impossible. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the revelations, they had threatened to consume her entirely. But standing there now, Caroline felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. Her life had not returned to what it once was. It never could. But in the ashes of what had been, Caroline found the courage to build something new. Her bakery had flourished in the wake of the scandal, not just because of her skill, but because of her story. Customers often came for the pastries but stayed to exchange quiet words of encouragement, sharing their own tales of resilience. Caroline had become more than a baker, she was a symbol of strength for many in her community. Her children, now more attuned to their mother's emotions, had become her greatest allies. They filled the house with laughter again, their questions about their father growing less frequent as time passed. Caroline had allowed David supervised visits, but she kept firm boundaries. Trust, once shattered, could not be mended easily, if ever. Evelyn remained a ghost, her absence both a relief and a lingering shadow. Caroline often wondered where her sister had gone. Was she seeking redemption somewhere, or had she embraced the life of running from her mistakes? The questions gnawed at Caroline in quiet moments, but she had learned not to let them consume her. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't about reconciling with Evelyn, it was about releasing herself from the burden of anger. The hardest wound to heal, however, had been the revelation about her mother's silence. The admission had created a rift between them that time had yet to mend. They still spoke, cautious conversations that danced around the pain neither could fully articulate. Caroline often wondered if the bond would ever feel whole again. But for now, she accepted it for what it was, a scar on their relationship, a reminder of the fragility of trust. On this crisp morning, Caroline's thoughts wandered back to Sophia, whose funeral had been the catalyst for everything. Sophia, who had always championed honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. Caroline smiled softly, imagining what her old friend might say now. Probably something wise and infuriatingly blunt, she thought. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was hers. Caroline had reclaimed her story, choosing to live with authenticity rather than the veneer of perfection. The scars remained, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they stood as evidence of her resilience, her courage, and her choice to move forward. As she turned back to her bustling bakery, the bell above the door jingled, signaling a new customer. Caroline set her empty coffee cup on the counter, ready to greet the day. What would you have done if you were in Caroline's position? Could you forgive someone who betrayed you so deeply? And what about her mother? Do you think silence can ever be justified in the name of protecting family? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories that make you think, reflect, and feel. Your voice matters, and we'd love to hear what you think.